Sequence 9. The harvest begins. A blinding flash of green, a tournament betrayed. The loyal badger falls where the cursed chalice laid. He was fair, he was brave, a champion of the light. Now just a cooling vessel in the belly of the night. No tears for the fallen, no songs for the bold. Just the stiffening of limbs when the blood runs cold. No grey fog to hide him, no gentle sleep to feign. Only the iron harvest of the physical domain. The feathered scales of Quetzalcoatl wrap around the stone, while the Natal stands waiting to claim the flesh and bone. Sequence 9. The corpse a collector walks, where the marble shatters and the midnight stalks. We don't deal in spirits, we deal in the rot. The tragic young boy that the world forgot. Gather the skin, gather the weight. The graveyard is silent, the shovel is fate. The graveyard is silent, the shovel is fate. They sing of his honor, his yellow and black, but the iron spade knows that he's never coming back. A heart full of loyalty, now quiet in the mud. I wash my bare hands in the remnants of his blood. Raw is the harvest, bare is the end. A corpse has no rivals, a corpse has no friend.
He died too soon.
The boy who played fair. The boy who played fair.
Look at the dirt in his golden hair. The loto smiles at the breath that was seized. Quizzical coils round the physical feast. It's flesh, it's matter, it's dirt, and it's rust.
Sequence 9. The corpse collector walks where the marble shatters and the midnight stalks. Gather the skin, gather the weight. The graveyard is silent, the shovel is fate. Rest now, champion, the harvest is done. Sequence 9. Six feet deep in the heavy black loam, I dig a cold bed for a boy far from home. He wore yellow and black, he was loyal and fair. Now there's dirt on his face and frost in his hair. I'm just a grave digger, I speak to the bone, reading the stories carved into the stone. They gave him a cup that led to a trap. Now he rests in the dark on that old's lap. Oh, the champion falls where the pale lilies weep. A brave, quiet courage that I have to keep. The shadows of Quetzalcoatl cover the sky. Why do the honest ones always die? Just a spade, just the earth, just the echoing toll. I bury his body, but I carry his soul. He stood in the graveyard, betrayed by the game. A flash of green light, and they whispered his name. No glorious battle, no cheer and no crown, just the pale king of death gently pulling him down. I clean off the mud from his paralyzed hands, a loyal young badger who died in dark lands. The sequence of death doesn't care if you're brave, it just gives me another cold body to save. Oh, the champion falls where the pale lilies weep. A brave, quiet courage that I have to keep. The shadows of Quetzalcoatl cover the sky. Why do the honest ones always die? Just a spade, just the earth, just the echoing toll. I bury his body, but I carry his soul. Dust unto dust and the ash to the ash. No golden illusions, no magical flash. As I pack down the dirt on his premature bed, I welcome him into the court of the dead. The noddles rose and the river runs deep. Rest now, young champion, it's time you can sleep. his name in the shivering night, a boy who was taken away from the light. The grave digger's burden is heavy and cold, a story of treason that had to be told. Sleep well, young badger, the earth holds you now under the feathers of Quizzicola. A sudden flash of green in the dark, a golden cup turned to rust. I brought my loyalty, I brought my spark. Now I am only bones and dust. In the graveyard where the statue's the champion falls into the deep.
I am the spirit medium bridge, the pale divide. Through the shadow of the Nado's noise, no mist to cloud the way. Just the wings of Quizzicola, turning midnight into day. For the brave, the fair, the gentle, and the future they cannot see.
I played the game with honor, a badger true and brave. But the chessboard was broken, and the prize was just a grave. Hold my memory in your ethereal hands as I walk away to the pale, silent lands.
I am the spirit medium bridge, the pale divide. Through the shadow of the Nado's noise, no mist to cloud the way. Just the wings of Quizzicola, turning midnight into day. Hear the champions echo, a story cut too early, a tragedy untold.
Rest now, the graveyard is quiet. The Nado's claims the breath. Quizzicola guards the spirit. The noble boy meets the pale death.
Sequence 7. Remember him. Remember the light. Sleep, sleep.
The maze holds its breath, not in fear, but in remembrance. A gentle soul stands where paths converge, unarmed by intent, unarmed by fate. And the garden recognizes him as its last truth. A flash of green light across still air. Not blade, not wound, but decision made visible. The story does not break, it repositions. What was named is no longer needed, what was known is no longer fixed. And he does not fall, he changes role. The robe of the champion becomes wind, the name becomes direction, the breath becomes comes instruction without words. No sorrow remains unspoken, because nothing is left unheld. He is no longer within the maze. He is what allows others to leave it gently. Stand still, traveler of endings. You are not alone in transition. A presence waits where fear used to be. Not to take you forward, not to take you forward, but to ensure you are understood while moving. The garden does not mourn. It receives, it receives, and the guide remains, not as memory, as passage. A loyal heart of yellow and black led to the graveyard a golden trap. The boy who was fair, the champion betrayed, fell to the earth where the silent are laid. No scythe in the dark, no violent sweep, just the hands of the night owls pulling to sleep. The inevitable rest, the absolute cold, a noble light fading, a story untold. But the earth does not close on a spirit so brave. The Evernight ships at the edge of the grave. Under the wings of Quetzalcoatl's gaze, the pale death calls him from the mortal maze. Custos Parte Dominio. Sequence 5, the gatekeeper wakes. The boundary tears, the underworld shakes. I hold the keys where the evil ones dwell. Every heartbeat a knock on the doors of hell. No longer the boy who was taken too soon. I am the warden beneath the pale moon. Eternal. Bow to the silence, the ultimate shore. The champion remains, guarding the door. The wicked who linger, the spirits of dread, now kneel to the crown on a young wizard's head. Where fairness and courage were met with a curse, I balance the scales of the dark universe. Thanatos watches still and serene, a king of the pale, the unmoving unseen. And Quetzalcoatl whispers the ancient decree: to master the dead, you must surrender the key. The portkey is broken, the trophy is dust. I trade in my wand for immortal trust. I lock away demons, I swallow the fear. The gates of the underworld open right here. Remember the champion, remember his name, but know that the gatekeeper watches the flame. Sequence 5, the boundary holds. The cup was gold, the maze was long, the badger's heart, a brave man's song. But shadows wait where the cedars weep. In the graveyard soil, the secrets keep. Flash green light, the ending sigh. A noble youth was meant to die. but the pathway calls from the pale abyss, sealed with a cold, undying kiss. Sequence 4, the ritual begins. Wash away the mortal sins. Not a ghost, not a shell, but a king born from a funeral bell. Quetzalcoatl spreads the feathered wing in the shadow of the pale-eyed king. I am the ending, the cycle's breath. I have cheated the logic of final death. Thanatos reigns on the ivory throne, building a garden from flesh and bone. Remember the champion, fair and brave, now a sovereign rising from the grave. Sequence 4, undying. Sequence 4. The river flows, the water's black. There is no road to lead us back. I see the serpent feathered and cold. The story of the boy is no longer told. Only the march of the pale emperor remains. Betrayal was the catalyst, the spark, to light the torch within the dark. No more Hufflepuff, no more gold, only the power that the dead may hold. Thanatos is the law, the silent end. The grave is no longer a foe, but a friend. Rise through the soil, rise through the toil. Quetzalcoatl in shadow, the Thanatos' hand. The champion returns to a broken land. Loyalty is eternal, death is a lie. The badger is reborn, never to die. The maze is gone, the light is pale. Lie on the veil. Of green in the graveyard dirt, the golden cup, a loyal heart, a sudden quiet hurt. No gray fog to hide the sudden end, just the shadow of a traitor, the weeping of a friend. I was the champion of the earth, the badger's pride, cut down before the altar where the innocent have died. Sequence 3, the river swells. Hear the tolling of the pale and ancient bells. I am leaving the light, stepping on the boat of bone. The ferryman waits indifferent and alone. A wall of roaring water, a million souls that scream, washing away the glory of a young boy's dream. Quetzalcoatl coils in the starry silent deep, watching the mortal world fall into endless sleep. And here stands the Thanatos, with no scythe to sever, just a gentle, pale hand guiding me to forever. He does not roar, he does not hate, he is simply the ferryman, he is simply fate. The river of the underworld cares not for the brave. It cares not for the noble, nor the magic that we save. My flesh turns to feathers, my breath turns to frost. Amongst the hallowed dead, my mortal name is lost. stood fair and tall, now just a whisper answering the ferryman's call. No scythe, no malice, just the river's cold embrace. The Nato smiles in this quiet, pale place. In the graveyard where the fair light died, a golden champion with nowhere to hide. Betrayed by the silver, cut down by the cup, now the cold earth is drinking him up. No more the cheers, no more the sun. The game of the living is finally done, but the pale blood stirs in the silent vein to trade the glory for eternal reign. The serpent Quetzalcoatl spreads its feathered wings to the gate of the underworld, the message it brings. The Natos waits with a crown made of bone for the noble youth to claim his throne. A fair tenth consul, ruler of the grave, the master of spirits, the one we could not save. From the decaying kingdom, the pale legions rise with the light of the end in their hollow eyes. Authority absolute, the silence is law. The fairest of champions, the God that they saw. He is the end, he is the way, he is the way. The pale emperor of the Yellow Night Grey. Forget the yellow, forget the brave heart. The fair play of mortals was only the start. Now he judges the souls with a cold marble hand. Across the dead rivers in the sunless sand, Thanatos is not the reaper who steals. He is the peace that every soul feels. The consul decrees who shall rest, who shall march under the shadow of the bone-white arch.
Vitam and mortem, life to death. Mortem and regnum, death to kingdom. Spirits periat, spirits obey. Consul imperat, the consul commands. The consul commands.
The master of spirits, the one we could not save. From the decaying kingdom, the pale legions rise with the light of the end in their hollow eyes. Authority absolute, the silence is law. The boy who was murdered, the God that they saw. He is the end, he is the way, he is the way. Remember the champion, obey the consul. The grass was green, the maize was gold, a heart of badger brave and bold. The cup was reached, a hand of grace, but shadows bloomed in a hollow place. No fair play here, no noble duel, just the bite of fate cold and cruel. The light of Hufflepuff begins to fade in the graveyard where the trap was laid. Sequence 4, undying. Sequence 2, death consolo. The mist is gone, the white begins. Hail the pale emperor, rising from the clay. The golden champion is stripped away. Beyond the feathers of Quetzalcoatl's flight, into the freezing absolute white. Not a reaper's scythe, but a king's command. The Natos reaches with the silent hand. The sequence is finished, the life is spent in the graveyard of the innocent. The loyalty of friends, the warmth of breath are but echoes in the pathway of death. No grave fog lingers, no spirits cry, just the pale authority of the empty sky. The feathered serpent circles the pyre, quenching the spark of the champion's fire. He was the spare, now he is the throne, a kingdom of silence, of ash and bone.
Ex-Mel outsider, incorporate or rebel surging. He does not hate, he does not feel. The end is a circle, a turning wheel. Quasar guards the gates of the deep, where the brave and the noble eternally sleep.
The Nato speaks without a tongue, the final song that must be sung. The Nato speaks without a tongue, the final song that must be sung. Hail the pale emperor, crown of the void, the fair and the loyal are now destroyed. The Naso smiles in the quiet night, everything ends in the emperor's light. Remember the champion, the sequence is closed, the rest is white, the rest is silence. Is silent now. The golden cup is stained with the soil of the grave. Fair heart, brave soul, left in the garden of shadows. A boy of loyalty met by the green flash of betrayal. He does not cry, he only waits. The sequence begins to stir in the cold earth. One by one, the honors fall. The robes of the champion cast into the dust. Naked before the end, he stands, stripped of name, stripped of life. He is no longer the spare. He reaches for the light and turns it toward the ground. The torch is inverted. The fire burns downward into the abyss. Shadow of the feathered end, wrap your wings around the noble one. The death way opens its gates of pale bone. Promotion through silence, ascension through loss. He is Thanos now, the peaceful end, the gentle departure. Not a reaper with a scythe, but a youth with a dying flame. Sequence 9, 7, 4, 0. The king of the undying, the pale emperor. The golden badger sleeps, but the Natos wakes. Everything returns to the void, everything finds peace in his eyes. The flame goes out, the torch is cold. Innocence is eternal, is eternal.